Tonight we present Don Freed, who is a professor of linguistics. He is also a playwright and has done many plays as well as books. Some of you may have heard of the play Inquest, which was a play about the Rosenbergs. He's also done a book called Agony in New Haven, which was the story of Bobby Seale and Erica Huggins' trial. His latest book, The Glass House Tapes, is about the new police industrial complex. And finally, there is the movie Executive Action, and Don was the co-author of that script. And tonight he'd like to talk to you about what happened in Dallas and how it relates to Watergate. Don Freed.
Thank you very much, and to all those who organized this evening so well. Bring greetings from my co-author, Mark Lane, who is involved in the Wounded Knee trials. And he asked me to make clear that we disassociate ourselves from the statements of the producer and distributor of the film Executive Action that it was, quotes, pure entertainment, close quotes, and not meant to have any political impact. We wrote the original scenario and the novel, remnants of which remain in, I suppose, what is, after all is said and done, a unique American film, in order to give a kind of a signal of hope that the decade of conspiracy and lying might be drawing to an end and that the potential for intervention on the part of citizens was great. And we, in our East Coast tour recently completed, we asked the people go into the lobby of the theaters playing the film with their own simple handmade petition demanding independent investigation of the assassinations of the 1960s and opening of the archives and so on. And so we feel that the film is terribly important, though there is much more that could be in it. Tonight we're going to show you a 1-minute film clip that was refused by the flagship stations of NBC, CBS, and ABC in New York, on the rationalization that it was too violent. Well, there's no violence in it, and there's no violence in the film, in fact, except for the assassination, which is underplayed purposely. But it gives us an insight into the extreme sensitivity of the media on this subject, as indeed their sensitivity is extreme on what is called the Watergate affair, Operation Gemstone, when it reaches the issue of violence, organized state violence. And after showing that, I want to show a rare copy of the Zapruder film, a bootleg edition, with a narration by Dan Rather. And I'll have something to say about that because it's extremely revealing on several levels. And then I have a piece of tape from an almost unheard of interview with Lee Harvey Oswald in the summer of 1963, wherein he makes a startling slip of the tongue. Now that's the forensic material for the evening. But before getting into that and then talking about the dialectic between Dallas and the Watergate, and leaving a lot of time for questions and discussion, I would like to face head-on the issue as it's now drawn about the right to know and the motives. You remember that those first people who stood on point to defy the Warren Commission conclusions, the official mythology, were called scavengers and buffs and nuts and madmen and opportunists, and whereas those who wrote books supporting the Warren Commission were called historians. But they were alone. They had to defend themselves on every side. Careers were destroyed, or there were attempts to destroy careers of people like Mark Lane, and it was reminiscent of the picture George Orwell painted when he said there was truth and there was untruth, but if you clung to the truth even against the whole world, you were not mad. That was the condition just a decade ago. Later, the researchers came along, the historians, now the novelists, the filmmakers, and it's now a comfortable position to occupy. The vast majority of the American people, up somewhere over the 90 percentile now, reject the one lone nut theory of the Warren Commission. It is still stubbornly maintained, however, by the leading influence makers in the media and educational complex. And that is why it is such a dangerous symbol of the entire lack of credibility, not just on the politics of the 1960s, from Dallas through the Vietnam War to Watergate, but on the whole entire question of secrecy, on the entire question of whether one can trust one's senses, and whether or not official mythology can be defied, and whether or not there is a crisis in the whole process of communication, sense perception, and learning theory that flows from the stubborn maintenance by the state of an official myth. Now, the material you're going to see in here has been suppressed, and none of it exists for the public. What we're going to show is a bootleg edition of just a 20-second piece of film of the actual assassination. And I think we do well to talk about what the implications are for educated people vis-a-vis these traumatic events of the 1960s. Our political right to know, I understand to be a political abstraction of what the Greeks called ananke, the biological need to know. The right to know is a constitutional right, which may or may not be exercised to our own peril. But the need to know, according to the Greeks, and I think it's true, is not something over which you have any control, any more than you do hunger or sleep or sexuality. And you defy your need to know, the public defies its need to know, at the cost of physical, psychological, and philosophical survival. This need to know is displayed in a kind of endopsychic compulsion on the part of the public, who has made this film Executive Action #1 in the nation as of last week. And the film is not Citizen Kane or Z. And the reviews are controversial and negative, but the crowds are enormous. And it can only be explained one way: a biological need to know, an obsession, a therapy, in a nation which is bound hand and foot with lies, in a nation whose name has become the name of a nervous disease. The need to know, and it's the vicissitudes of that need, our political right to know, and I think that's basically the theme. Now, what is the answer? The New York Times, on the 10th anniversary, ran an editorial on the op-ed page with a familiar kind of reductive, crackpot psychologizing of this entire need. The people who doubt the Warren Commission, we are told, like those who hysterically demand the resignation of President Nixon, are in the last stages of Oedipus complex. The president stands for the father, and there is therefore a vulgar compulsion to cut him down. And that's what's really behind this doubt of the Warren Commission. If the president was killed, if one lone nut had done it, why then any of us were capable, and we therefore identify with the assassin, and so we erect an elaborate conspiracy to play off against the trauma of the assassination of the president. Well, we're familiar with this reasoning. Bruno Bettelheim, the psychoanalyst, told us during the Vietnam War, remember, that the protests had nothing to do with moral or political or human revulsion with that slaughter, but instead it was a rebellion without a cause. It was a knee-jerk kind of response against the fathers of the state who knew better and were prosecuting the war. And that was the meaning of the student-led protests of the 1960s. The precursor to that incisive piece of analysis is Bettelheim's theory of the genocide of World War II, that the Jews and the other victims of the concentration camps were paralyzed by masochistic passivity. And that is offered seriously as a rationale for the aberrations of Dealey Plaza, at My Lai, at Watergate, all aberrations, no pattern, and that we are called paranoid. That now, of course, is up about to 90% of the public, but then again, the American public is notoriously conspiracy-minded. And it's an aberration. Lee Harvey Oswald was to Dallas what William Calley was to Vietnam. These are not aberrations, and the war was not an aberration, and Watergate is not an aberration. That is simply official mythology, and it's a scandal so stale and so stereotyped that no serious person outside of the leading circles of the educational establishment and the media can maintain it. So there it is, the need to know. Now, we're not told in these editorials anything about the Oedipus complex of the conspirators, or the very picture of Oedipus complex as a matter of fact. When you are asked to accept official rubbish as an article of faith. We were told by the New York Times when the Warren Commission report came out that it was the greatest investigation in the history of the world. And you remember Attorney General Kleindienst telling us that the Watergate investigation was the greatest investigation since the Warren Commission. And that anybody who doubts these investigations is some kind of scavenger with some kind of ominous panoply of motivation. Well, Oedipus complex simply is the infantile acceptance of the lies of power. That's Oedipus complex. Not protest against the war in Vietnam or the investigation of the assassinations and of Watergate. Those are the philosophical terms, then, of the issue. Now, let's have our material, and then I'll try to talk about what I call the secret government and the span from Dealey Plaza to the Watergate. And this first is a 1-minute coming attraction banned from television.
At this point in time, can you believe that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President John F. Kennedy by himself? Burt Lancaster, Robert Ryan, and Will Geer take executive action in a drama where startling fiction challenges established facts. They were all experiencing back operations. You take your chances and you get paid for it, and damn well. A story built on a long investigation, pinning together the missing pieces in the most important murder of our century.
Are you trying to tell me people the CIA and FBI are going to help with this project?
Could one man alone assassinate John Kennedy? One man fired from all range of enemy fighters out of the question. The impossible scenario is 3 rifles with triangulated fire. A motion picture that must be seen by anyone who still has doubt.
The explanation for keeping that off of television that is too violent. Too violent. From the same people who brought you Vietnam nightly. Now, John will let me know when this next film has to be. It's the focus is bad, the sound is bad, but let me tell you what it is. Dan Rather, a young Dallas reporter, came to national prominence in reporting on the assassination, and he saw the Zapruder film, a film taken by an amateur photographer, Abraham Zapruder, from in front of the president's limousine, and from exactly the same direction, obviously, that the fatal bullet comes from, a grassy knoll with a picket fence. And Dan Rather watches it, and then he reports to his radio audience what he's seen. There are 2 significant errors. One, he says you see Governor Connolly turning and you see Governor Connolly hit by a bullet. Well, of course, you remember that the Warren Commission, which had to account for 3 bullets and no more, one that hit the curb, which they finally took cognizance of after a man insisted for 8 months that it bounced off the curb and injured his cheek, one that hit President Kennedy fatally, and one that supposedly went through President Kennedy's back, up and out his neck, into Governor Connolly's back, out his chest, into his wrist, out his wrist, into his thigh, and was found in pristine condition on the gurney at Parkland Hospital. But you see, the greatest experts in the world can only reload that virtually inoperable Italian rifle at a rate of 2.5 seconds per shot. So therefore, only 3 shots could have been fired. Otherwise, there would have had to have been more than one shooter. And, says the Warren Commission, if you reject the magic bullet theory of the bullet 399 that went through everybody without losing any lead, then you must reject the conclusions of one lone nut propounded by the Warren Commission. That magic bullet theory, by the way, is the brainchild of Arlen Specter of Philadelphia, who has just joined Mr. Buzzhart in the nick of time to represent the president, and I assume evolve a theory of the tapes that may include people from outer space. If I understand Mr. Haig's allusions to sinister forces, therefore making our position obligatory that it's one lone nut. Now, you will hear Dan Rather describe what you obviously see, that Governor Connolly is hit by a separate bullet, which he has always maintained, and then in the next breath maintain that he accepts the conclusion of the Warren Commission, which is impossible, according to the Warren Commission, to accept. But the shocking phenomena is you will see the president's head driven backwards as if by a pile driver from the fatal shot. And you will hear Dan Rather announce that his head is driven forward. And that has been the position all along. And it creates something amounting to schizophrenia in the viewer to see one thing and hear another, not because Dan Rather's ethos is overwhelming, but because that is the official position. And that official position came out of the control room in the White House within an hour of the assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald's entire background was on the wire services around the world within the hour. And the one lone assassin 3-bullet theory was solidifying within the first 12 hours. It had not solidified to the extent that Rather still had to report that Connolly was hit separately. That later was changed, of course. I don't think Rather is a conspirator. I think, though, you see the fantastic power of the state to intimidate us, to make us censor ourselves. As one witness finally told the Warren Commission when asked how many bullets he heard, he replied, "I heard one more than was fired." So much for masochistic paralysis. But we are all, in a way, a part of the silence to varying degrees, and therefore we do right to be shocked by this. You will now see the Zapruder film.
Right below the window.
doubt there. Well, I think that's the metaphor, both the violence and the distortion that characterizes the 1960s, when war became peace with honor, when systematic assassination became pacification, when police-state tyranny became democracy. Mrs. Kennedy, in a clear film of this, remember this film was suppressed, of course, they dare not be shown to the American people. Mrs. Kennedy is covered with blood and brain matter, as are the two motorcycle policemen riding to the left rear. The reason she crawls up on the trunk, which you can see in a clear film, is to retrieve the president's brain and skull, which is on the trunk of the car. Of course, the car was immediately taken back to Detroit. It was destroyed. There was no forensic analysis ever made, or of the clothing, or of anything. There was never any autopsy. And Dr. Cyril Wecht, the coroner of Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, head of the forensic medicine at Duquesne University, who gained permission to go into the archives last year, discovered that the president's brain was missing. That was again in the New York Times on November 22nd of this year. The brain from which he could have determined finally from which direction the bullets came. But he saw enough to declare that there's a conspiracy, though photographs and x-rays are also missing. But it doesn't matter that those things are missing when we demand of our representatives and in our various ways that the archives be opened, because just as in the case of the missing tapes, the blood-red footprints will lead to the bottom of the conspiracy in the end, to the top, I should say. And so I take that Dealey Plaza event as a metaphor. I think there is a further irony, which makes it a Hegelian tragedy, that the very men pulling the triggers in Dealey Plaza, the laundered money that they used, the CIA spy masters who were running the teams, were all men who just 2 years before had been brought together as an assassination team to kill another president of state, Fidel Castro, and run by the White House. And after the terrible humiliation at Playa Girón, and after Kennedy saw that he'd been had in his attempt to substitute Green Beret, Special Forces, and intelligence for the brinksmanship of the 50s, and he tried to take apart the CIA, and he tried to stop these suicidal adventures of imperialism. These men who now considered him the great betrayer, who had aborted their efforts to assassinate Castro, came back to haunt him at Dealey Plaza. And that's the final reason, in my opinion, that Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and the Kennedy family could never press for a real investigation, because it would, of course, have disgraced their administration, as well as perhaps exposing the conspiracy. Well, the laws of physics haven't changed in 10 years, and while there is some new information, I think the structural violence of the 1960s is important to consider. I think before going into that, I should give the last piece of new material to you. Lee Harvey Oswald was interviewed on radio and television in the summer of 1963 as part of an attempt to create a communist or left-wing cover for him against the day of the assassination. He was interviewed by a man named Edward Butler, the head of a group called Information Council of the Americas, INCA, which is a private intelligence complex. He later went to work for the Schick intelligence apparatus in Southern California, student newspapers, groups like Young Americans for Freedom and so forth. And he later became an aide to Charles Colson in the planning of the hard hat attack, the violent attack on the peace demonstrators in New York City that you may remember. So there is one of the personnel links between Dallas and the Watergate. So Butler has some guests on, and one of the guests is questioning Lee Harvey Oswald, who, by the way, was an extremely articulate, shrewd, even glib talker, the worst kind of witness for a conspiracy. And he is speaking easily, effortlessly, sounds like an associate professor of something or other. And suddenly he's asked this question of how he supported himself in the Soviet Union, and he begins to stutter. And then you will hear the slip.
You and the other members of your organization, so you are the face of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. Therefore, anybody who might be interested in this organization ought to know more about you. For this reason, I'm curious to know just how you supported yourself during the 3 years that you lived in the Soviet Union. Did you have government subsidy?
I will answer that question directly then, since you will not rest until you get your answer. I worked in Russia. I was under the protection of I was not under the protection of the American government, but that is, I was at all times considered an American citizen.
When that was transcribed into the Warren Commission report, it read, "I was not under the protection of the American government." The Warren Commission tells us in the preface that the testimony of witnesses has been edited for clarity. So much for the opinion of our government for us. Now, I want to speak about the secret government forces behind these events of this last period, and indeed the quarter century of the Cold War would be the broader frame of history, but just this decade. By secret government, I don't mean a power elite exactly. I certainly don't mean some Illuminati or Wise Men of Zion or Wall Street gang or any melodramatic group of men sitting in a room somewhere, though that takes place. I mean a secret government that's a process, a dynamic and changing phenomena that is endemic to our kind of democracy, with its official elected government, its rhetorical rights, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, Constitution, the superstructure of rights and democratic prerogatives. And depending on the industrial state of the nation, the infrastructure of corporate power and interests, which changes. The Civil War, the agrarian forces versus the northern industrial forces fought a battle to the finish, while the superstructure question of manumission and of slavery occupied the rhetorical arena. So that the Cuban patriots, when not off on CIA adventures, are involved in organized vice. They come out of the organized vice of Havana. And organized crime has an ideology, and it is anti-communist, and it works with intelligence, and each has their aims and their ends. In the same way that in Indochina, the opium from the Golden Triangle is run by the Kuomintang and the various tyrant client states that we call the free nations of that area of the world. CIA cargo planes carry the opium, which is changed into heroin, which is shot into veins in New York and San Francisco, the huge profits of which are laundered through the organized crime conduits and reinvested again into electronics firms, aerospace industry, and military-industrial complex. So is it organized crime, or is it anti-communist intelligence, or is it war industry? Jack Ruby is organized crime, but he's also running guns out of the Dallas area to the CIA training camps and to the anti-Castro counterinsurgency brigades. David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald's babysitter, to use a phrase, in New Orleans, is a Minuteman, a bodyguard for Carlos Marcello, a organized crime kingpin in New Orleans, and a long-time CIA contract agent. So is he a right-winger, or is he organized crime, or is he intelligence? There were Minutemen involved in Dallas in the assassination, as there were in the assassination of Martin Luther King, and there are organized crime elements, and when I say organized crime, I mean the Teamsters Union and corrupt unions, and there are anti-Castro Cubans, and there are emigre fanatics, but what holds them together? Intelligence. Intelligence is the glue. gives the money, gives the weapons, gives the plans and the direction and the cover story, and provides the protection in the aftermath. Intelligence, out-of-control elements of the CIA, all through the 60s. Never mind what's called backdating, the fact that the CIA sanitized its record in the Pentagon Papers or in books like The Brightest and the Best. Had we used nuclear weapons and won some kind of a victory in Southeast Asia, you can be sure they would have produced cables predicting all along from the 50s that we would win, instead of the ones they produced that we would lose when it became clear that we had lost. So never mind the backdating. Now, those components can be identified in Dallas. For those of you who've read the nonfiction novel, Executive Action, you know that we do identify. We make composite figures of the conspirators, except for one who's only thinly disguised. And you see that, for example, organized crime bought a bankrupt small electronics firm, laundered money into it. It cannibalized other electronics firms, became a giant aerospace consortium, General Dynamics, dependent 100% on war contracts. Its biggest contract, called the TFX airplane, being produced by its Dallas and Southwestern subsidiaries. A leak that corruption and cost overruns were so massive as to threaten the entire stability of the military-industrial complex. The TFX investigation begins. The assassination. 1 week later, the TFX investigation is dropped. Well, what is General Dynamics? Is it aerospace? Is it organized crime? Is it intelligence? They all merge. As in Watergate, Hunt, Liddy, all the others worked under the cover of narcotics control. Nothing but an intelligence front for political repression. Now, E. Howard Hunt was in Mexico at the same time Lee Harvey Oswald was. Frank Sturgis, a CIA sharpshooter, came forward 1 week after the assassination to help lay the cover that Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist, saying he'd been seen meeting in Miami with Castro agents and so forth. Oswald hadn't been to Miami, and Sturgis disappeared, and the story came to nothing because the public didn't demand it. The one lone nut theory was accepted. But just behind that theory was another revetment. If you didn't accept one lone assassin, then it was a communist conspiracy. Fair play for Cuba. Oswald was a defector to the Soviet Union, which you've just heard him make a slip of the tongue about. If you don't accept the communist conspiracy, then it's a Minuteman conspiracy, because David Ferry, Guy Bannister, and all of those who worked out of the private detective agency in New Orleans, which was a CIA safe house and served as a Minuteman hangout and a CIA conduit for materiel and guns to the Lake Pontchartrain training camps for the counter-revolutionary guerrillas and to the Caribbean, New Orleans being the base of operations for intelligence for the Caribbean, as Dallas is for the Eastern European intelligence community. Well, then Lee Harvey Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba Committee office was in this Minuteman CIA safe house. Any good investigative reporter would have found that out in 2 hours. There was no Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He hired 2 men from unemployment for $2 an hour to pass out leaflets. He only consorted with Minuteman and CIA contract agents and oil, petrochemical, and CIA contracts in the Dallas area. He didn't know any leftists. He was never seen with any. So there was the Minuteman revetment and/or the organized crime revetment. And finally, had there been a national uproar as in Watergate, in the end the information would have been given up that Lee Harvey Oswald was, shame to say, an informant for the FBI, S-172, and the FBI would have been shaken to its foundations, and Hoover would have been disgraced, and the nation would have trembled, but we would have survived and pulled together. But never would what the White House likes to call the bottom line have been exposed. Now, you've heard Charles Colson, the president's aide, described as liaison to groups. That was his job description. You heard Mr. Haldeman say that on television. Liaison to what groups? Teamsters, organized crime, Carl McIntyre, American Security Council, the Liberty Lobby, neo-Nazi, neo-fascist elements, to the ethnic communities in the eastern cities with their chains of newspapers, many of them run by former war criminals, to ITT, to the milk lobby, to special interests in general. And it's Colson who arranged for San Diego. And what was planned for San Diego was black and Chicano agents provocateurs posing as leftists, causing violence in the street, using explosives, and former Minutemen in a group called the Secret Army Organization, an underground paramilitary unit in San Diego, run by a terrorist named Howard Berry Godfrey, an agent provocateur for the FBI. That was to be the right. They were to kidnap the radicals, follow the Liddy plan, control air-to-ground communications, send a radar-controlled plane full of explosives at Air Force One in a simulated or bogus assassination attempt. The right and the left shooting at each other. The center collapses, as in Greece, a classic intelligence scenario. When the political operatives of Watergate, Operation Gemstone, began to get the intelligence flow coming from their own provocateurs, they said, we must move to Miami. And the paramilitary wing of Operation Gemstone, as opposed to the Southern California old boy gang of Ehrlichman, Haldeman, the Magruder types, the Dean types. But the hardliners, Colson, Hunt, Liddy, the Cubans and others, they could not, of course, say that's what we want is violence, so they were to move to Miami. And who were to be the leftists in Miami? Well, William Lemmer has testified. Provocateurs, posing as Vietnam veterans against the war, moving on delegates to the convention with automatic weapons, that's the left, and the right, of course, anti-Castro Cuban exiles. So, again, the model is extrapolated from San Diego to Miami. But when the men are arrested at Watergate, it's all aborted. It comes to nothing. But that's the bottom line. Same kind of intelligence scenario. Some of the same personnel in Hunt and Sturgis and Cubans. And the same kind of paramilitary intelligence control, as opposed to the Red Squad police types, Ulasewicz, Caulfield, who are snooping on people, blackmailing people, but who shrink from burning down the Brookings Institution or kidnapping radicals. For that you need the paramilitary hardliners. Hunt, Liddy, the others, and they're moved in. And the hardliners, the paramilitary, as always, takes over the political, whether it be Vietnam or whether it be Washington. Nixon, in his moral idiocy, created a climate where anything went. And the hardliners, who had in mind far more than 4 more years, moved in inexorably, taking over the politicals and taking control of Operation Gemstone. And after the violence, in vain would Nixon and Mitchell have said, we didn't intend you to do that. As Nixon said, he didn't intend Eagle Crow to break in to Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, but he told him to leave no stone unturned in finding out about Ellsberg. They would have said, we didn't intend you to do that, and Hunt and the others who would have been invisible if they hadn't been arrested, no one would ever know them or heard of them. They're clandestine deep cover operatives. They would have said, too bad, you gave us the money. You signed on. And they would have only had to pick up a telephone to bring down the administration. They would have had them like that. Absolute control. And that is why, after George Wallace was shot out of the election and Nixon was running 20 to 30 points ahead in the polls, that is why the conspiracy did not miss a beat. It was not stupidity. They didn't need it anymore for Nixon's re-election, 4 more years of electoral power with checks and balances. But they did need something for what amounts to a coup de main, a seizure of power from within, the penetrating of the bureaucracy down to the 3rd and 4th levels, FAA, NTSB, FBI, CIA, Secret Service, IRS, agriculture, health, OEO. OEO was being turned into nothing but an intelligence operation for the barrios and ghettos. Phillips, from Young Americans for Freedom, an intelligence front set up in the early 60s by E. Howard Hunt, William F. Buckley, Charles Colson and others, to be pitted against SDS, Tom Charles Houston to be the opposite number of Tom Hayden. Vietnam, remember Viva, Victory in Vietnam, which became cosmeticized as Voices in Vital America. Remember the Veterans for the Peace with Honor. All of the intelligence fronts, the biggest of which became the Committee to Re-elect the President. Nothing but an intelligence front to coalesce and bring together the weapon of organized crime, war industry, and the elements of propaganda that were needed. Now, in each case, the cover-up turns on it being an aberration. At Watergate, 4 clowns, a circus tramps, a prank, a third-rate burglary. You remember that. You remember that official executive investigation, which is just like the Warren Commission. Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone nut, Arthur Bremer with his the unemployed janitor's assistant who spent $7,500 in 1972 alone. The phone call from Colson to Hunt to break into Bremer's apartment in Milwaukee to see if he could find any left-wing literature. Hunt said he didn't have time to get there, but nonetheless a copy of the Black Panther Party newspaper and Angela Davis literature was discovered in Bremer's apartment. These are not aberrations any more than My Lai. We know now that leaflets were dropped countless times, places like My Lai, Song Mi, that entire area, in order to terrorize the countryside, that the orders came down from above, that it was systematic, that it was persistent, that it extended over time, that it was part of Operation Phoenix, the author of which is now the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So much for automatic reform coming out of Watergate. And that the Lieutenant Calleys, like the Lee Harvey Oswalds, simply followed orders. And the General Peers, the Peers Commission, was not an army cover-up, as Seymour Hersh argued in the New York Times, but an intelligence cover-up. Peers is CIA, not Army, though he's a general. I think that to grapple with this systematic and organized violence, it is necessary to see the pattern, to understand the inevitability of secret government in what we can call a bourgeois democracy, an infrastructure that constantly and always and must, by the imperatives and dynamics of industrial development, undermine the superstructure of rhetorical rights and privileges. And that a cover-up in 1963 has the aim of maintaining the status quo ante, of keeping the country from coming apart, just as the investigation in 1973 has exactly the same aim of restoring the status quo ante. If cover-up is called for, then cover-up. If investigation is called for, then investigation. But the aim is to restoration of the status quo, and not our right to know and not our need to know. And that is why the Watergate investigation stops and will always stop, short of violence, short of the coup plans. And I think that those of us who simply enjoy watching the spectacle on television are deluding ourselves, and that we are nothing more than foolish spectators at a circus for Caligula. Because, as you remember, at the end of the McCarthy period, when we had investigations, ventilation, scandals, exposures, reforms, the word McCarthyism became a byword for left, right, and center. It would never happen again. It could never happen again. And within one generation we had Watergate. And what is to say that within one generation we will not have something as much beyond Watergate as Watergate was beyond McCarthyism? There is nothing automatic. Power simply changes hands. It changed in April. The government fell. In April, it has fallen. The Kennedy Circle, sometimes called the Yankees, the Doves, those interested in protecting the dollar, they have taken power away from those sometimes called the cowboys, the hardliners, the cold warriors, the new money, as opposed to the old money. Power has passed while we like the figures in Julius Caesar, we petty mortals peep about beneath the huge legs of the colossus of the state. We have this moment of maneuverability as the secret government is being exposed, and unless we seize the time and move into that vacuum, none of that power is going to accrue to us. And we are no better off than before, except for a change of style. And so objectively, the time is now as never before. The American public is sound. They rejected the Warren Commission from the beginning. The media frightened them, paralyzed them. They got conflicting messages daily from all the big media. It drove them mad. And that's why they appeared apathetic and cynical about the Pentagon Papers, while the intellectuals and liberals were shocked. Well, what had the man and woman in the street to be shocked about? He'd seen it all acted out in the way he could understand it at Dealey Plaza and the Ambassador Ballroom and the Memphis, Tennessee motel. He saw it in the flesh and blood that bled through the official abstractions and mythology. But he didn't have an anti-mythology offered him. The movement, the left, for the most part, except for the Black Panther Party and certain elements of black liberation who had taken up the issue of Malcolm X's assassination and therefore provided a perspective for the assassinations. And so when Martin Luther King was assassinated, the pattern was already part of the vocabulary of the agitation of the Black Panther Party and the black liberation movement. Except for that element, the left was totally paralyzed. Why? Because Oswald's communist cover had worked. There was the fear of a Red Scare, a Red Purge, as never before. What if there was a conspiracy, as Lyndon Johnson said at the end, finally, in the uttermost of cynicism, in an interview with Walter Cronkite where the words were censored but published after his death. He said it was a conspiracy, Oswald never acted alone, but of course he implied. He said, I found a Murder Incorporated being run in the Caribbean by the White House when I came in, he said. And therefore Castro took his revenge in Dallas. Well, he was wrong on 2 points. The Murder Incorporated was now operating independently of Kennedy, and it was that same Murder Incorporated made up not of pro-Castro, but of anti-Castro Cubans, that is, as lumpen proletariat trigger men at the bottom, who surfaced at Dealey Plaza. So there was this admission of a conspiracy. Now, liberals, the left, couldn't face it, though now I think it's swept over everyone but the leadership, as I say, of the media and the academy. And the moment was lost. The man and woman in the street were left undefended, no one speaking for them. You cannot understand the American people if you do not understand the meaning of this assassination in the national psyche in 1963, which they watched for 48 hours on television, together with the Jack Ruby footnote. It was literally programmed into them. An entire population watched television for 48 hours and got conflicting messages steadily. That was their Pentagon Papers. That was their White House horrors that liberals eventually came to appreciate. So it isn't cynicism and apathy. It's fear. That's what it is. Fear with its defenses of what cynicism, apathy, and the intellectuals, boredom, disinterest, depending on class. Once you understand that, you understand the fear of the New York Times and Time Magazine and others when they insist that the great danger is the public will think that all politicians are corrupt, and that this is just a little worse, and they must not think that. It must be seen as an aberration. But you see, the public is sound because they've become isolationists. They hated the anti-war movement, but they finally hated the war more. And they became isolationists, much to the contempt of the liberal establishment. But what is isolationism? Isolationism for the man and the woman in the street is anti-imperialism. That's what it is. But that's their way of seeing it. These assassinations of their way of understanding official state violence rather than das Kapital. And we have to address ourselves to this, because the Gallup poll, which dared not run a poll on acceptance of the Warren Commission on the 10th anniversary of the assassination, dared not run it because it would have scandalized and humiliated the big media to show 98 or 99% of the American public rejecting the Warren Commission, which the media must defend at all costs, lest they be lumped with the nuts and buffs and scavengers that they derided for so long. But they took a poll you read about confidence in the government, and said Gallup, choosing his words carefully, not since the assassinations of the 60s has confidence been lower. Not since the assassinations of the 60s. A very shrewd conscious or preconscious choice of words. And we have to grapple with this. These atavistic, violent images that are part of the American nightmare and from which we cannot wake up, despite the fact that we may be educated, until we can confront it and demand a quick accounting, not on who pulled the trigger and who's going to jail, but an accounting of why we have been shown forged and doctored infantile evidence for the assassinations, for the war, for Watergate, and now for the energy robbery, that these are somehow aberrations that come from elsewhere, for which we are supposed to feel guilty about, whether it be the assassinations or the war or the energy crisis. So renunciations that we are supposed to make in order to anneal these terrific psychic blows. We are not so free of this guilt and this masochistic passivity, to use Bettelheim's phrase in a sane way. And I think that the understanding of the linkage between war industry, organized crime, corrupt unions, and the intelligence fronts and propaganda fronts is something that we can understand, if we will, and something the American people can understand too. And I think we have to deputize ourselves as people who can read and write, who are educated. And we have to do it, because the state is not going to do it. The state is the author of the cover-up, and elements of the state who are out of control are the author of the violence in the first place. And it is up to us, in the words of Jean-Paul Marat, to pull ourselves up by our hair, turn ourselves inside out, and, paraphrasing, learn to see ourselves, the world, and the state with new eyes. Thanks very much.